You understand the technology, the process, and the solution. But when you present in English, does your audience understand it as clearly as you do? Today, we're going to practice phrases that help engineers and technical people explain complex ideas clearly, organize technical information clearly, and present results, handle questions, and then close with confidence. Okay, let's begin. Welcome and welcome back. I'm Coach Theo, your senior professional and business English coach. And today, we are going to focus on engineering presentation English. I'm going to share with you 50 phrases to explain technical ideas clearly, both to technical and non-technical audiences. First, let's look at the communication problem. Technical knowledge is not enough if the audience cannot follow your explanation. Too much detail too early, technical terms without translation, charts without interpretation, weak transitions and unclear next steps. These all confuse or may confuse the audience. And so, just to add why this is important, an extra step here, or an extra point, this lesson and the things I'm going to share, these are career skills because engineers who can explain systems, results, risks, and recommendations clearly are easier to trust with clients, senior leaders, cross-functional teams, and larger responsibilities. So, what are you going to learn in this lesson? First, you're going to learn the goal is not to sound more complicated. The goal is to make complicated information easier to understand. You want to open with purpose. You want to organize technical information. You want to explain systems and workflows. Simplify complex ideas and present data and recommendations. So, this information I'm going to share in the lesson is specifically designed for engineering presentations, technical reviews, client explanations, and leadership updates. I want to emphasize that the phrases can be adapted for software, manufacturing, systems, data, product, and infrastructure engineering. Let's look at opening the presentation. And the formula here is purpose, problem, and audience benefit. This will keep you on track. Let's begin. Today, I'll walk you through. This will introduce the topic naturally. Next, the purpose of this presentation is to, this will state the objective clearly. The key question we need to answer is, this will focus the audience on the decision. By the end of this presentation, you'll understand. This will set the learning outcome. This matters because this will connect technical detail to impact. I'll focus on the technical decision or decisions that affect. This will define the scope. So I'm going to give you an example. Listen closely. Today, I'll walk you through the proposed redesign of our monitoring system. The purpose of this presentation is to explain why we recommend moving to a modular architecture. The key question we need to answer is whether the current platform can support the expected increase in users. This matters because system downtime directly affects customer transactions. So Take this example and the examples that I use throughout this lesson and adapt it to your business. Because as you can see, I clearly stated purpose, problem, and audience benefit. Now let's look at previewing and organizing. This will help your audience follow your structure. I've organized the presentation into 3 parts. This previews the major sections. Let's begin with the current state. You start with the existing situation. First, I'll explain how the system works today. Create a clear starting point. Next, I'll show you what is changing. You move from current to proposed. This brings us to the next part of the presentation. This is a transition that moves smoothly. Before we move on, let me summarize the main point. This will recap before adding more detail. Let me give you an example. I've organized the presentation into 3 parts: the current system, the proposed design, and the expected results. Let's begin with the current state of our data processing environment. Before we move on, let me summarize the main point. The hardware is performing correctly, but the communication layer is creating delays. Next, we have explaining systems and architecture. This is where you talk about the components, connections, inputs, and outputs. At a high level, the system consists of. This gives the overview first. The main function of this component is to you explain one part of the system. This component communicates with. You describe dependencies or connections. The system receives input from. This shows where information enters. The output is then sent to. This shows where processed data goes. So as an example, at a high level, the system consists of 3 services: a shared database and an external payment gateway. The main function of this component is to validate incoming requests before they reach the database. This component communicates with the sensor network through a secure wireless connection. If you're getting a lot out of this presentation so far, please give us a like. Next, we have explaining processes and workflows. We show the sequence and cause and effect. The process begins when this will introduce the first event. Once that step is complete, show what happens next. From there, the process moves to guide the audience through stages. This step triggers explain cause and effect. The process is complete when you define the final output. Here's an example. The process begins when the user submits a request through the application. Once that step is complete, the system performs an automated security check. This step triggers a notification to the maintenance team. The process is complete when the test results have been validated and stored. Simplifying complex ideas. This is when you translate technical meaning for the audience. In simple terms, give a less technical explanation. Another way to think about it is this will reframe an abstract idea. The technical term for this is you will introduce vocabulary with context. What that means in practice is this will explain the practical effect. For example, in simple terms, the system checks whether the user has permission before allowing access. Another way to think about it is that the gateway acts like a checkpoint between the two networks. The technical term for this is load balancing, which means distributing traffic across several servers. What that means in practice is that users should experience fewer delays during peak periods. Now, let's look at using comparisons and examples. This is where we make the idea easier to picture. You could think of this as you introduce an analogy. The easiest way to see the difference is to compare, contrast two options. For example, imagine that you create a realistic scenario. The important distinction is you prevent confusion between similar ideas. Here's an example. You can think of this as a traffic control system that directs each request to the least busy server. The easiest way to see the difference is to compare the current response time with the redesigned system. The important distinction is that encryption protects the data, while authentication verifies the user. Next, we have presenting data and trends. You want to do more than just read the chart. The chart shows this is where you identify the visual element. The most noticeable trend is you direct attention to the pattern. As you can see, the value increases when. Here you explain the relationship. The data begins to change at. You identified a threshold or turning point. Here's an example. This chart shows the average processing time over the last 6 test cycles. The most noticeable trend is the steady reduction in error rates after the software update. As you can see, the temperature increases when the motor operates above 80% capacity. The data begins to change at approximately 500 simultaneous connections. Next, we have explaining results and performance. This is where you connect test results to real impact. The results indicate that this will introduce evidence-based conclusions. Compared with the previous version, you will show improvement or decline. The improvement is mainly due to this will explain why performance changed. The practical impact is this will connect results to operations. As an example, the results indicate that the new configuration can handle significantly more requests. Compared with the previous version, the updated design requires fewer manual interventions. The improvement is mainly due to faster data retrieval and better memory management. The practical impact is faster order processing and fewer customer service escalations. Next, we have risks, limitations, and uncertainty. This is where you sound honest without sounding unprepared. There are two limitations we should keep in mind. This is where you acknowledge constraints. The main technical risk is, this is where you name the most important risk. At this stage, we cannot confirm whether you explain incomplete evidence. Our current estimate is based on, this is where you state the assumption behind a forecast. Let me share an example. There are two limitations we should keep in mind. The test environment was smaller than production, and the trial lasted only 4 weeks. The main technical risk is that the legacy database may not support the new transaction volume. Our current estimate is based on simulated traffic and the results from the pilot environment. Next, we have handling questions and interruptions. This will help you stay calm, clear, and organized. That's an important question, and I'll address it in the next section. Here you defer when the answer is coming. Let me answer that at a high level first. You start with the simple answer. The answer depends on which scenario we are considering. Clarify conditions. I'd like to separate that into two questions. You break down a complex question. Let me share an example. That's an important question, and I'll address it in the next section when we compare implementation costs. Let me answer that at a high level first. The system is secure because access is controlled at several different points. The answer depends on which scenario we are considering: normal traffic, peak traffic, or system recovery. Now, let me share some recommendations and closings. This is where you finish with a clear direction. Based on these findings, our recommendation is to: you present evidence-based action. The next step would be to: you explain the immediate action. The main takeaway is you reinforce the core message. To conclude, this approach gives us, this is where you close with the overall value. Let me share an example. Based on these findings, our recommendation is to complete a limited pilot before beginning the full migration. The next step would be to test the design under production level traffic. The main takeaway is that the proposed architecture improves performance without requiring a complete system replacement. To conclude, this approach gives us greater reliability, more flexibility, and a manageable implementation path. Okay, now let's take a look at a mini presentation example. It's a technical audience, and we're going to look at system improvement. The phrases that we will use are, at a high level, the system consists of, the process begins when, the results indicate that, there are two limitations based on these findings. So now I want you to listen to a sample talk track. Today, I'll walk you through the proposed redesign of our monitoring system. At a high level, the system consists of a data collection service, a processing engine, and an alerting platform. The process begins when a device sends performance data to the collection service. Once that step is complete, the data is validated and transferred to the processing engine. The results indicate that the redesigned system processes alerts more quickly than the current version. The improvement is mainly due to parallel processing and more efficient data storage. There are two limitations we should keep in mind. The test involved a limited number of devices, and we have not yet tested the system under full production load. Based on these findings, our recommendation is to proceed with a larger pilot. Next, we have another mini presentation example, and this is a non-technical audience where we will discuss business impact. We will use phrases such as, the purpose of this presentation is to, in simple terms, you can think of this as, the practical impact is, the next step would be to, and now I'm going to give you a sample talk track. The purpose of this presentation is to explain how the proposed monitoring system could reduce service interruptions. In simple terms, the system continuously checks the condition of our equipment. You can think of it as an early warning system. It identifies unusual behavior before the equipment fails. The practical impact is that the maintenance teams can respond earlier, customers experience fewer disruptions, and the company avoids some emergency repair costs. At this stage, we cannot confirm the exact savings under full operating conditions. However, the initial results are encouraging. The next step would be to test the system in one operational location before expanding it across the organization. Let's take a look at common technical presentation mistakes. And you want to avoid these if you want your audience to understand and to act. You want to avoid beginning with too much background. Just calmly state the purpose, the problem, and the outcome early, as I said in the beginning. Using terminology without explanation. Translate the term into practical meaning. Describing data without interpreting it. Explain the trend, cause, and impact. Presenting every available detail. Choose details the audience needs for a decision. ending without a recommendation. Finish with the conclusion and next step. Let's take a look at our final review now. Choose 5 phrases for your next technical presentation. 1 phrase to open the presentation. 1 phrase to explain a system or process. 1 phrase to simplify a technical idea. 1 phrase to explain data or results. And 1 phrase to make a recommendation. Remember, the goal is not to sound more complicated. The goal is to make complicated information easier to understand. Please like, share, subscribe, comment, and I'll see you next time as we continue our linguistic adventure together. Take care, everyone.